Welcome to Lecture 2 in Neuroanatomy. We'll begin by talking about the brain. So the brain functions to do a lot of different stuff. Of course, you can move around using your brain. It controls your bodily functions of visceral activities. It determines your personality, stores memories, makes decisions. I don't know. The Greeks didn't think this is where your soul resided, but I think that the common thought, if you believe in a soul, is this is where it's at. The brain's got some major parts. It's got the cerebrum, the diencephalon, which is in the central brain, the cerebellum, and then the brain stem. And the cerebral cortex is what differentiates us from the rest of our animal cousins, more or less, and it's divided into the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. Also noted this thing called the insula, and I'll refer to that later. So the brain's divisions are illustrated here in a little more detail. So one of the things that's important to know about the cerebrum is that it's divided. There's a central commissure. There's a central fissure that divides the two halves of the cerebral cortex. And we when we look at the cerebral cortex, we see these convolutions, these raised portions we call gyri, and the indentations called sulci. And they're differentiated from fissures, which are these great divides that really help us differentiate between the different lobes of the brain. The diencephalon is this, like I said, the central portion of your brain, and it relays information from the cerebral cortex down into the other portions, and it includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. There's those two parts are all about controlling, deep regulations for emotions and things like hunger and anger. And there's also another portion of the diencephalon called the mesencephalon. And we will get into the details of it, which are complex. The brain stem is made up of the pons and the medulla oblongata. And then at the back of the brain, we have this structure called the cerebellum, which generally does a lot of coordination stuff. This is where you find some of the most densely packed neurons or cells in your whole body. So once again, the gyri are the bumps, the sulci are the grooves, and the sulci and gyri are what helps us identify the different lobes of the brain. So the central sulcus, or sulcus of Rolando, separates the frontal and parietal lobes. It's also is where we find the motor and sensory cortexes. And then you have these fissures. Remember that the central commissure, or the central fissure, a longitudinal or sagittal fissure, separates those two cerebral hemispheres. The transverse fissure separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And then we have this lateral fissure of Sylvius, where the lateral sulcus, and it separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobes. Those two cerebral cortexes are joined by something called the corpus callosum. And we've already seen some videos on what happens when you sever the corpus callosum. It allows the left and right side of the brain to communicate under normal circumstances, but for people that have conditions that lend themselves to surgery, for instance, severe epilepsy can be mitigated to a degree. In the case of epilepsy, we have an electrical storm that has some initiating locus. There's a central sort of a point in the brain where there's some neurons will start this electrical storm. And if they go unchecked, they can spread to the rest of the brain. And so for patients with that type of severe grand mal epilepsy, if you sever the corpus callosum, you can kind of stop that happening. But you have these weird outcomes. So fascinating. Again, here are the lobes of the cerebral cortex. And they're separated. They're identified by these sulci. The central sulcus divides the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. But let's talk about the frontal lobe. Look, this is where, in a sense, this conscious thing that's you right now in the present moment exists. This is where decisions are made. This is where you process um, complex things like other people's emotional state. The frontal cortex is what differentiates us um, from our hominid ancestors. So the Neanderthal actually had a bigger brain than ours. However, their frontal cortex wasn't as well developed. And so at the at the very, very front of the frontal cortex, we have this place where executive functions reside. Now, the frontal cortex is, again, differentiated from the parietal cortex by this central sulcus. And right in front of the central sulcus, the first part of the frontal cortex is the primary motor cortex. So this is where you control your skeletal muscle. So when you think about the frontal lobe, think about control, just how you present yourself out into the world. This is where your ego resides probably, and as opposed to the parietal lobe. So at the delineation here between frontal and parietal lobes, we have the central sulcus, and just behind the central sulcus is the primary sensory cortex. All right, that's where all your sensations come from. That's where the feelings of from your tips of your toes to the bottom of your feet is felt. It's where the neurons are that are associated with the control of that. And the parietal lobe generally is what we call the associative area. So it takes in information and then helps coordinate it. Sends stuff to the frontal cortex, sends stuff to the temporal lobe, sends stuff into the deep regions of the brains. So the parietal lobe, think about association areas. The temporal lobe is on the side, and right where your ear is. And of course, guess what's there? The primary auditory cortex. So that's where the neurons associated with hearing are located. And oddly enough, the occipital lobe, which is way in the back there, is where you'd find your primary visual cortex. All right, so that's where information for vision is occurring, and all the associated functions for vision to be processed. Well, the cerebral cortex is really important. This is, as I said, where all the action's happening, and it's super complicated, but we'll do like a peripheral scan of how it's organized. So remember, again, here's the central sulcus separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This is the primary motor cortex right here. So these are where the neurons that control motor skeletal function. The frontal cortex also has association areas. And in the very prefrontal cortex, this is where these executive functions reside. In fact, one of the things that differentiates teenagers from adults is a maturation of this region of the brain. So this is where what's the difference between a teenager and an adult is that they have poor impulse control. They have difficulty interpreting other people's emotional states. They lack empathy. They don't make good decisions. So if any of those things are happening, that's because your brain isn't completely developed. Here, remember, this was the lateral sulcus or the Sylvian sulcus separating the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. Inside of here, I have the insula of Rayl. And there's all kinds of cool things happening down here. This is where the cortex for taste or gustatory cortex is, and smell occur. These are really deep cortical regions. Also, you have this somatosensory region, and it allows you to feel your organs, which is kind of interesting, and I'll hit on that later. On the temporal lobe, this is your primary auditory cortex, your primary auditory cortex and the association areas. Again, back here we have the occipital lobe. I have the visual cortex. This is where information from the eyes is going directly, and then the association areas. Again, the central sulcus separates the primary motor cortex from the primary sensory cortex. So the parietal lobe is all about the association, the taking in of information and making associations. This is where the sensations of your body and your organs is fed to. And there's a little map there called the homunculus we'll see in a sec. So the outermost layer of the cerebral cortex has all these convolutions, the sulci, gaps, the gyri, these bulges, And it actually is made up of gray matter. So remember what we talked about when we talked about the spinal cord being composed of white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside. The opposite's true here. So the outer region of the cortex is gray matter made up of neuron cell bodies or soma, and in the interior you'll find white matter. Here's another summary. It's the same thing. Remember that behind the central sulcus, we have all these association areas for sensory information. All right, well, there's a cool little map here called the homunculus. What is a homunculus? Well, this is an artist's impression of like what the sensory neurons are devoted to by number. All right, so you've got a lot of sensory neurons in your lips and on the tips of your fingers, and we see that played out in gory detail here on the cortex. All right, so note here, we're looking at the primary sensory cortex here. Here's the map. This region of the primary sensory cortex has neurons associated with sensations coming from the genitals. Here's your foot, your leg, your thigh. Here are the neurons associated with sensory information for the face, etc. See the homunculus, the little man? On the other hand, just in front of the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex. Here are the neurons that control your swallowing reflex, your tongue, your lips, your nose, the muscles of facial expression. There are the neurons. So if I took an electrode and I jammed it in here and electrocuted some of those neurons, it might make your eyelid raise. Or here, it might make you ball your fist up or kick somebody over here. All right, so we have the primary motor cortex, primary sensory cortex, and they're mapped out into these little maps of men called the homunculus. Cool stuff. There was a guy named Penfield who mapped out these regions of the brain. During brain surgery, he would just take an electrode and shove it in here, and the patient might say, like, I taste oranges. Pretty cool. Awesome to be a brain surgeon. I think it's a 12-year residency, though. So remember that if you're not a primary motor or primary sensory area, then you're going to be associative cortex. So this is association. What does that mean? Well, I'm sending information out to different regions of the brain. When we talk about this, it's certainly complicated, right? I would like you to know that this is where your auditory area is, and this is where your visual area is. Remember that I'm hearing things, and when I hear things, especially language, I need to make associations with that. And so here's a specialized region called Wernicke's area. And this is where the region of the brain that's associated with understanding spoken language. Damage here will disallow you from understanding the things you're saying. And I showed you that video of that fluent aphasia where the patient had the words, he could speak, he just couldn't make any sense about what he was saying. With that in mind, here's Broca's area. Note that it's in the frontal cortex, right? This is where motor stuff happens. This is where decisions are made. Broca's area is where spoken speech is, and it's actually where the words are. So the ability to say the word oranges is here. Now, this is where you know what an orange means. This is where you can say the word orange. And that's one of the fascinating aspects about cortical function. All right, all over the brain are these different regions, different groups of neurons associated with things like recognizing human faces. All right, so there's a classic neurological deficit called prosopagnosia, and you can't recognize people's faces. And of course, I had you do a reading from Oliver Sacks' famous book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for Hat, and that was a patient who suffered from that disorder. Prosopagnosia, or agnosia, and fascinating stuff. Hang on, I'll be back.